Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk about the writing process heuristic. And you remember that a heuristic is simply a step-by-step process that we use to accomplish a task or to help someone learn something. That's a heuristic. We talked about that the other day. Now, the writing process heuristic, like the reading process heuristic, is this step-by-step process. In the writing process heuristic, we want to use it to help us write about college materials, including articles, chapters in textbooks, essays, even fictional, biographical, or autobiographical materials. Everything that we write in college, we can use the writing process heuristic as a tool to help us write papers. It's an excellent tool, actually. And the writing process heuristic itself can be divided into 4 different stages. Sometimes we call them stages or phases, steps. First you do this, then you do that. So the first phase or step in the writing process heuristic is what we call pre-writing, and that is everything you do before you begin actually drafting the paper. Okay. Sometimes we call pre-writing brainstorming, but pre-writing is more than just brainstorming, so I don't really like to call it just brainstorming. And I've made this list of activities that we can do during pre-writing. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you don't have to take notes. You'll have this video available, and the notes are actually on the screen. If you're watching the video, you're not seeing the screen. Or you're looking at the screen on your computer as you're watching the video, or listening to the video if you want. So you'll notice here that we have gathering information, list making, free writing, mapping or clustering. You see these diagrams. I think the textbook showed you a diagram, or the reading showed you a diagram that's mapping or clustering. We have incubation. I'm going to come back to some of these. Conversations and interviews, asking questions like who, what, when, where, and why. Planning or outlining or scaffold making. Certainly understanding the writing task. You need to be, evaluating what the writing task is, which includes knowing the subject well, understanding the purpose, understanding the audience, developing a thesis. Any other special requirements, learning what those are. This is all part of pre-writing so that when you begin to draft, you are ready to go. Okay? I'm just going to read this one. Reading and all activities in the reading heuristic make this the most important activity during pre-writing. Reading is the most important activity that we can do during pre-writing. So the reading heuristic falls primarily within the pre-writing phase of the writing process heuristic. And this is where reading and writing come together. Because, of course, in college, we write about what we read. Okay, so in order to write, we have to read something. We're essentially gathering information when we are reading. All right, so that we can write informatively. The primary purpose for writing in college is to inform. To inform the professor that we know something, that we know the material, whatever it is. Okay? And of course, as we're reading, we're going to do this. We're going to maybe take notes, make lists. Writing also is a form of pre-writing, especially if it's free writing, or sometimes we call free writing stream of consciousness writing. Mapping or clustering. Some of us, if you were taught to do this in elementary school or in junior high, or maybe some teacher taught you how to do this, that's fine. I particularly don't like it. I just prefer making notes. drawing lines. I mean, you can draw lines, draw circles, whatever it is that is easiest for you. Okay. Having a conversation with classmates about what you're going to write is important. That's part of pre-writing. We do that in this class. Interviewing others to gather information is also a good thing to do. There's just so many ways to get information that we're going to be writing about, that we can present in a well-organized paper. Organizing, structuring, scaffolding is part of pre-writing, right here. Developing our thesis and knowing what it is. A thesis or focus. Sometimes a thesis is called a focus. Our paper usually has a single focus. And as we're writing, if we always keep that focus in mind, it helps keep our writing going in a particular direction. Okay, so all of this belongs as part of pre-writing. It will help, you've heard of writer's block before?
Yes.
And it's like you sit down and I don't have anything to write about this. Well, why? It's because you haven't done any pre-writing, you haven't done any reading, you don't have the background information about something. Now, there are some topics, of course, that are easy for you to write. And why are these topics easy for you to write? Because you know something about them. So, of course, if you know something about it, like when you were writing about yourself, because you know everything about yourself, or at least I hope you do, it's easy to write about yourself. But if you're going to be writing about a given topic, okay, if I were to ask you to write about why it's important to understand what you read, and I just said, well, why is it? Well, maybe some of you would have a bit of a block, it's just I'm throwing that topic at you, and it's like, well, what do I say about understanding the need to understand what we read? What do I say about that? All right, so that comes from a textbook, and when you read about it and you think about it, then it becomes a little bit easier to write about. You have information that you can present. So all of this is pre-writing, and we have done it in this class already. We have engaged in some pre-writing activities. When I put you in groups to talk about questions, to talk about the content or the material from a reading that we're going to write about, that is pre-writing. So we have already engaged in some pre-writing activities in this class. All right. Once you've done, the important thing to remember is that there are many different pre-writing activities that you can do, but you can't do all of them. You shouldn't do all of them. You pick and choose the ones that may be appropriate for the assignment, or the ones that really help you the most to get started writing, to give you the information so that you can get started writing. And that's what we do when we draft or we write. Once you have spent a sufficient amount of time pre-writing, actually you really can't spend too much time. You want to spend a lot of time pre-writing. The more time you spend in pre-writing, gathering information, making sure you understand and know the topic, you should be like, suddenly you will feel like, I've got to start writing about this. I'm just so full of this information. I really have to get going with it, or because I'm afraid I'm going to forget about it. That's when you should draft your paper according to your scaffold that you've developed, according to your outline or your list or whatever it is that is going to help you go point by point through your paper. Okay, then you start drafting, and when you draft, you want to get your whole paper down. You want to get all of your ideas and get your whole paper done as quickly as you can. So you want to set aside a big chunk of time just to sit down and write the paper. However long you think it's going to take, 2, 3, 4 hours to get that paper chunked out. Not caring about grammar, mechanics, all right, even typing errors, issues, MLA. Don't care about any of that. It's all about just getting the content out in a draft, in a rough draft. that's basically according to whatever outline or scaffold that you have developed to guide you through this drafting process. Okay. And then don't worry about trying to be perfect as you write, because the more you worry about being perfect as you write a draft, you're gonna start developing writer's block. You guys are so fortunate because you can draft on a computer, so that errors and issues can easily be changed and corrected. Okay, back in the day when I had to write, we didn't have computers. I think I told you that already. So I couldn't, I had to use a typewriter and white out, or we had a correcting ribbon. Often I made holes in the paper with erasers, and I had to keep throwing paper away and starting again. And the only way I could finish my MA thesis was that a friend of mine got a new computer back in, what year was it? It was back in 1984. All right, when computers were in its infancy, and he had one of the state-of-the-art computers, and he was going on vacation for 3 months, and he said, go use the computer in my home office and finish your thesis, and I did. And that was the only way I was able to do it, was because I could do it on a computer and not on a typewriter. So you guys are so lucky to have this available at this point in your educational career. Okay, so you just pound out the rough draft. Just pound it out. Get it done, because it is in revision where you shape your paper and you get it to a point where you think that you can submit it. All right, and this is really the most important part of the writing process. It's during revision that you shape your paper into a document that the professor will find acceptable. And revising, now notice that revision means to see again. That's what revision means. It doesn't mean to change or to correct or any of that kind of stuff. It means to read again, to see again. All right? But as we read again, we can decide what we want to do to this material to improve it. Sometimes we need to add material, especially if it doesn't meet a word length or page length. Sometimes we want to throw out material if it's not related to what we're writing about. Maybe we want to rearrange material. It can be paragraphs, a sentence, a word, a series of paragraphs. All right, this is what we can do. It is during revision where you think about what you've written and make what you have written better in terms of being clearer, more logical, more detailed, more convincing. And when you revise, these elements here are what you want to take into account. Okay? So so you're going to do those things, but you want to take into account whether the subject of the paper has been dealt with in an adequate way. Have you stated the thesis clearly? Have the ideas, information, and paragraphs been organized in ways that allow the readers to understand what you're telling them? Is each paragraph focused on a single idea? And this is sort of why I'm having you do the film review assignments, because I really want you to learn how to focus a paragraph on a single idea. And so when I ask you to write about one single message in a paragraph, that's very important, because so many of us will throw in lots of different messages, lots of different reactions. Have you written with your audience in mind? Who's your audience? The professor, sometimes your classmate. Does the introduction present information that makes the reader understand what the paper will be about? Does the conclusion do more than just summarize? A good conclusion will analyze, evaluate, solve problems, provide options, and allow you to gain insight. And in this class, as we work through papers, because it's such a short class, I developed the scaffold for you, and we'll include these items. So it's important that you follow the scaffold and that you use the scaffold as a model, so that I want you to evaluate. I want you to analyze the scaffolds that I give you that will help you write a paper, so that when you are taking other classes, you have a sense of what you need to do with an assignment in terms of how you can develop scaffolds. Developing scaffolds or outlines for assignments, papers are really important. Now, when I talk about formal outlines, when I talk about outlining, I don't mean formal outlining. I just mean like it can be listing, it can be just note-taking in an order, it can be developing a scaffold with sentences, words, whatever. It's very informal. Okay. Revision is not editing. Sometimes I refer to revision as being global and editing as being local. Global, local, macro, micro. And we really want to keep editing separate from revision. When you're revising, you're really looking at the ideas, the information, and what you need to do to improve them. Now, once you've got all of that set and the organization of your paper set, then it's time to think about editing. And you do a formal editing just before you turn a paper in. You read over it again, and you look for error in terms of issues of style and issues of grammar and mechanics. Issues of style include paying attention to word choice and the way in which the sentences are written so they are clearly and directly understood. Issues of grammar and mechanics involve matters like correct spelling, correct grammar, and correct use of punctuation. So revision and editing are different. Now, the writing process, as I have just described it, is not clean. It's not, different parts of the writing, things from different parts of the writing process or different phases bleed into each other. Like, we may be editing as we are drafting. Oftentimes we do that. We may be editing as we are revising. We may, as we're drafting, we may suddenly decide to revise a whole paragraph just because suddenly I have a different idea and I want to go back over this paragraph and revise it. And editing will happen throughout. But you want to have a particular block or time block for editing at the end where you do go back over the paper because everything else is set and you just work on editing. And this is very important. Okay? I think that's what I said here in terms of revision and editing are very different. Now, what I didn't put here in your notes is where does all of this information come from? How do we know that this is the best way to work in terms of writing a paper? Well, back in the 80s, a lot of research was done on how good writers write, good student writers write, and how poor student writers write. Indeed, when I was working on my MA thesis, I looked at, specifically my thesis looked at what good writers did when they wrote and what poor writers did when they wrote. And the general conclusion out of this research, and there was a lot of research, was that good writers go through these different phases to write a paper. And poor writers don't. Poor writers are given an assignment, and they do their best to write it, and then at one go, without much pre-writing, revision, maybe they will edit a little bit or try to correct, sometimes correct as they go. Or all of these 4 different phases of the writing process a writer will try to do at the same time. Pre-writing, drafting, revision, and editing. A lot of writers try to do all of these 4 things at the same time to write a paper. That's what I used to do. Okay. I told you I got a C in my first freshman composition class. I think that's why. Okay, because I tried to do all of this in just one sitting, the night before the paper was due. Okay, so that's why I do give you a couple of days to do a paper. If we were a 16-week class, you'd have more than a couple of days. But because we're an intensive class, we have to compress everything. Okay, so this is where it's coming from, and from some of my research and the research of my colleagues back in the 1980s. I told you I'm old. So this was, in the 1980s, this was considered cutting-edge research. Now no longer. Everybody just does, all instructors, teachers, researchers, they just sort of, this is accepted, settled. At the time, in the 80s, this kind of writing process approach was considered very controversial. Now, it's also important to understand that we don't become good writers in isolation. Okay, and that's why, having other pairs of eyes to read what we're writing as we are writing is very useful to us. It helps us become better writers. All professional writers do it. In fact, professional writers work with an editor assigned to them by the publisher. A writer writes something, submits it to the editor makes comments, edits even, returns it, the writer rewrites. It's a back and forth process. It's a collaborative process. So good writing really does become collaborative, not done in isolation. Which is why, of course, in this class, we work with our classmates as peer editors. And also, I encourage working with a tutor in our writing center or a tutor at NetTutor. It's really useful. If we, those of you who are doing it, I think are finding it useful. It's not perfect. You will find that your classmates maybe sometimes are not that helpful. Even sometimes a tutor is not that helpful. In the end, ultimately, you make the final decision as to what you're going to present to the professor in your final draft. But getting any kind of feedback forces you to think about what you're writing, and that's what's really important. And to determine whether you want to make a change or not, an improvement or not. Okay. Even when a professional writer works with an editor, they don't always agree about what, sometimes the writer will overrule the editor in terms of what he or she wants to do in the final draft before turning it in for publication. So I have this material at the website that I want you to read more carefully. It's also in our textbook. And in our textbook, not the textbook, but the reading, the aims and processes of writing, there's a whole section about how to work as a writer and how to work as a peer editor or peer tutor. This is very important. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of that. That's not the purpose of this presentation, is to go through each of those points. They're in the aims and processes of writing, but it's really the author Stanford makes it very clear what writers and peer editors can do to work together. And a lot of it is being cooperative, making sure that you go to your tutoring session either with a tutor or a peer editor with questions, with an idea of how the paper should be so you can work together with questions. Now, one thing that is very important when you are working with a tutor or you're working with a peer tutor or peer editor, check your ego at the door. Okay. Be prepared to accept some criticism. Some of us don't like criticism. We become very defensive when we get criticized. And it makes us feel uncomfortable. And it makes us feel small. All right, especially if our ego is kind of big. So we want to check that ego at the door and remember that the tutor or our classmate is trying to be helpful. Sometimes our tutor and our classmate is very blunt. I'm very blunt. And I know that many of you find it okay to accept criticism from a teacher, but it's harder from a classmate. I know that. So when you are the peer tutor helping someone else, keep that in mind. You don't have to be so blunt. You don't have to sound critical. You want to sound helpful. Okay? Giving advice, being helpful, having a manner that sounds that way so that you don't offend the ego of the person you're trying to help. Remember, we all have egos. Okay. But, one of the important things, as you're going through school, teachers take note of one thing about all of their students. Can students accept criticism gracefully? And some students are really good about accepting criticism and some students aren't. So it's really good to learn to hold back, push down your ego so that you can accept some criticism without being defensive. Remember, in a classroom situation, myself, I just want to be helpful, but I don't have time to always make nice. So I'm very direct, sometimes blunt. Sometimes it seems like I'm angry, though I'm not. What you have to learn is don't take anything personally from a teacher. That's where we get into trouble. Even if you think the teacher doesn't like you, don't take it personally. Don't get upset about it. Trust me, a teacher generally doesn't really care that much about, how you're feeling. Okay, keep that in. Boss is the same way. You have to sort of learn to deal with that. Although a good boss, a good teacher will be a little more tactful. I try to be, but it doesn't always work. Okay. But you as peer tutors want to, since you're working, at the same level as your classmates, you want to be as tactful as possible, as helpful as possible. Don't be afraid to give advice. And if you're getting advice, don't get upset about it. Accept it. And if you think it's not good advice, don't tell the classmate that, oh, you're giving me crap advice. I don't want that. Your advice is wrong. No, don't do that. Don't say any of that, because what's going to happen is then peer tutors, your classmates are not going to want to work with you, and they're going to stop giving you any kind of useful advice. Okay? It's like our good president, number 45, can't take any kind of criticism whatsoever. Such a fragile ego that 45 has. Notice I can't say his name today. Sometimes I just call him 45. So this is the writing process explained kind of in a nutshell. And the material is in the aims and processes of writing. And there's other material. This is a very important reading. It's a very, even more, just as important as the first reading that we did about the reading process. These two chapters are really, really important in terms of giving you a structure for reading and writing in college, which is why we spend some time with it. And, at some point you'll just do it naturally. You won't think about it, but you certainly want to go through a pre-writing, drafting, revision, and editing process to write your papers. And remember, pre-writing includes reading. Yes, it takes more time. Yes, sometimes we wait until the last minute and we have to figure out how to cut corners. It's not a good thing. We don't write good papers. Many of us would like to get A's for our work. That means you need to organize your time so you can do everything in the writing process. Thank you.